village in Nigeria, there lived a young girl named Jessica. She was the only child of Ada, a poor widow who struggled to make ends meet. Jessica's father had died when she was very young, leaving Ada to raise their daughter alone. Despite their hardships, Ada was determined to give Jessica a good education. She believed that with proper schooling, Jessica could have a better life than she had. However, the cost of education was far beyond what Ada could afford from her meager earnings as a local farmer. One day, Ada heard about a wealthy man in their village named Matthew. He was known for lending money to people in need, but also for his ruthless methods of collecting debts. Desperate to secure her daughter's future, Ada decided to approach Matthew for a loan. Matthew agreed to lend Ada 1.8 million naira to pay for Jessica's education. The terms of the loan were harsh. Ada had to use her late husband's house as collateral. Matthew made it clear that if they failed to repay the loan, he would take ownership of the house. Ada agreed, believing that once Jessica finished school and got a good job, they would be able to repay the loan easily. As Jessica grew older, she excelled in her studies, making her mother proud. But she also found love in the arms of a young village farmer named Abina. The two were inseparable, spending their free time together under the shade of a big tree near the village market. They would talk for hours, sharing the dreams and plans for the future. Abina was hardworking and kind, but he didn't have much money. Still, he promised Jessica that he would work hard to provide for her. They made plans to get married after Jessica finished school. Their love was pure and strong, untainted by the worries of the adult world. Years passed, and Jessica completed her education. She was filled with hope and excitement, ready to start her career and build a life with Abina. However, the reality of the job market in their area was harsh. Despite her qualifications, Jessica couldn't find a job. She applied to countless positions, but each time she was met with rejection. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the worry in Ada's eyes grew deeper. Matthew, the man who had lent them the money, started to visit their home more frequently, demanding repayment of the loan. Each time, Ada would beg for more time, promising that Jessica would find a job soon. But Matthew's patience was wearing thin. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he had no sympathy for their struggles. One day, he arrived at their home with a group of thugs. His face was twisted with anger as he shouted at Ada. "I've given you more than enough time," he yelled. "If you can't repay the loan, I'll take what's mine." Jessica and Ada watched in horror as Matthew ordered his men to start removing their belongings from the house. They fell to their knees, begging Matthew for mercy. "Please, Chief Matthew," Ada pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We'll find a way to repay you. Just give us a little more time." Matthew's eyes narrowed as he looked at the crying women. Then, a cruel smile spread across his face. "There is one way you can keep your house," he said slowly. Ada looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Anything, Chief, we'll do anything." Matthew's gaze shifted to Jessica. "Your daughter is a beautiful young woman. I'll forgive the debt if she agrees to become my third wife." Jessica felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Marry Matthew. The thought made her sick to her stomach. He was old enough to be her father, and she was in love with Abina. But as she looked at her mother's desperate face and thought about the prospect of them becoming homeless, she felt trapped. "I'll give you 4 market days to decide," Matthew said, signaling his men to stop. "If you refuse, I'll not only take the house, but I'll destroy it and build a new one for myself. Think carefully about your choice." With that, Matthew and his thugs left, leaving Jessica and Ada in a state of shock and despair. As soon as Matthew left, Jessica ran to find Abina. She found him working in his small farm plot, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tended to his crops. When he saw Jessica's tear-stained face, he immediately dropped his tools and rushed to her side. "What's wrong, my love?" he asked, holding her close. Through sobs, Jessica explained the situation, the loan, Matthew's threat, and his proposal. Abina's face darkened with anger as he listened. "We'll find another way," he said firmly. "I won't let you marry that evil man." But as they talked through their options, the reality of their situation became clear. They had no money, and no way to raise such a large sum in just 4 days. The thought of Ada losing her home and being thrown out on the street was too much for Jessica to bear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Abina's farm, Jessica spoke softly. "I have an idea," she said. "But you're not going to like it." Abina listened as Jessica laid out her plan. She would agree to marry Matthew, but she wouldn't actually be his wife in anything but name. She would refuse to let him touch her, buying them time to find a way to raise the money and repay the debt. Once the debt was cleared, she would leave Matthew and marry Abina as they had always planned. Abina was silent for a long time after Jessica finished speaking. The idea of her marrying another man, even in pretense, was painful. But he could see the determination in Jessica's eyes and knew that she was doing this out of love for her mother. "Are you sure about this?" he asked finally. "It will be dangerous. Matthew is not a man to be trifled with." Jessica nodded, her face set with resolve. "I'm sure. It's the only way to save my mother's home and give us a chance at a future together." With heavy hearts, Jessica and Abina agreed to the plan. They swore to keep their love alive, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The day of Jessica's wedding to Matthew arrived all too soon. The village was abuzz with activity, but the atmosphere was far from joyous. Everyone knew the circumstances of the marriage, and many whispered their sympathy for the young bride. Jessica wore a traditional white wedding gown, but her face was devoid of the happiness that should accompany a bride on her wedding day. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes met Abina's in the crowd. They exchanged a look of silent understanding and shared pain. Matthew, for his part, looked triumphant. He stood at the altar, his portly figure draped in expensive traditional attire, a smug smile on his face as he watched Jessica approach. His 2 other wives stood to the side, their faces impassive. The ceremony was brief, and before Jessica knew it, she was officially Matthew's 3rd wife. As the guests celebrated, Jessica felt as if she were watching everything from a great distance, detached from the reality of what had just happened. That night, as Jessica prepared for bed in her new room in Matthew's large house, she steeled herself for what was to come. When Matthew entered, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, Jessica was ready. "Don't come near me," she said firmly, backing away as he approached. Matthew's smile faltered. "What do you mean? You're my wife now." "I may have married you to save my mother's home," Jessica replied, "but I will never be your wife in truth. I don't love you, and I never will." Matthew's face contorted with rage. He lunged at Jessica, but she was quicker. She ducked under his arm and ran to the other side of the room, grabbing a broom to defend herself. "If you touch me, I'll scream so loud the whole village will hear," she threatened. For a moment, Matthew looked like he might try to overpower her anyway. But then, mindful of his reputation in the village, he backed off. "You'll change your mind," he growled as he left the room. "You'll see that being my wife is far better than being that poor farmer's woman." But Jessica didn't change her mind. Night after night, she rebuffed Matthew's advances. Sometimes she would scream, other times she would fight him off physically. Matthew became increasingly frustrated and angry, but Jessica remained steadfast. During the days, Jessica would sneak out to meet Abina whenever she could. They would reaffirm their love and make plans for the future. Abina was working harder than ever, trying to save money to repay Matthew's loan. Weeks turned into months, and still, Jessica resisted Matthew. The chief's frustration grew to the point where he could barely look at Jessica without seething with anger. His other wives whispered among themselves, some amused and others worried about what Matthew might do in his growing rage. One day, Matthew met his friend Okoro at the local palm wine tavern. After several drinks, Matthew confided in Okoro about his troubles with Jessica. "Can you believe it?" Matthew slurred, slamming his cup down on the table. "I married her, but she won't let me touch her. She's supposed to be my wife." Okoro listened sympathetically, then leaned in close. "I know a way you can solve this problem," he said in a low voice. Matthew's eyebrows shot up. "How?" Okoro glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then whispered, "There's a powerful native doctor in the next village. he can give you a charm that will make Jessica fall in love with you. She won't be able to resist you anymore. Matthew's eyes lit up at this suggestion. The next day, he made the journey to the neighboring village to seek out the native doctor. The native doctor lived in a small hut at the edge of the village, surrounded by strange-smelling herbs and animal bones. When Matthew explained his problem, the old man nodded knowingly. "I have just the thing," he said, shuffling to the back of his hut. He returned with a small pouch filled with a dark powder. "Put this in her food. Once she eats it, she will love you completely for 2 weeks. But be warned, after 2 weeks, the charm will wear off, and she will return to her old self." Matthew didn't care about the warning. 2 weeks seemed like plenty of time to him. He thanked the native doctor, paid him handsomely, and returned home with the charm. That evening, Matthew instructed his cook to prepare Jessica's favorite meal. When the food was ready, he carefully sprinkled the powder from the pouch over Jessica's portion. Jessica, unaware of Matthew's scheme, ate the food without suspicion. As she finished her meal, she suddenly felt strange. Her head felt fuzzy, and when she looked at Matthew, she felt a rush of affection that she had never experienced before. "Matthew," she said, her voice soft and loving, "why don't you come sit next to me?" Matthew could hardly believe his ears. He quickly moved to sit beside Jessica, and to his delight, she snuggled up against him. For the next 2 weeks, Jessica was a completely different person. She doted on Matthew, showered him with affection, and willingly shared his bed. Matthew was overjoyed, believing that he had finally broken through Jessica's resistance. What Matthew didn't realize was that during these 2 weeks, he had managed to get Jessica pregnant. In her charm-induced state, Jessica had no idea of the consequences of her actions. As the native doctor had warned, after 2 weeks, the charm's effect suddenly wore off. Jessica woke up one morning next to Matthew and was horrified to find herself in his bed. The memories of the past 2 weeks came flooding back, and she felt sick with disgust and regret. She immediately pushed Matthew away and ran from the room, locking herself in the quarters that had been originally assigned to her. Matthew, not understanding what had happened, pounded on the door, demanding to be let in. "Jessica, what's wrong? Open this door," he shouted. But Jessica remained silent, curled up on her bed, feeling violated and betrayed. She couldn't understand why she had acted the way she did for the past 2 weeks. It was as if she had been a different person entirely. In the days that followed, Jessica went back to rejecting Matthew's advances, but now with even more vehemence. She felt dirty and used, even though she couldn't explain why she had changed so suddenly. A few weeks later, Jessica began to feel ill. She was constantly nauseous and tired. At first, she attributed it to stress, but as the symptoms persisted, a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. She confided in one of Matthew's other wives, who suggested she visit the local midwife. The midwife confirmed Jessica's fears. She was pregnant. The news hit Jessica like a physical blow. She was carrying the child of a man she despised, a man who had tricked her somehow into sharing his bed. The thought of bearing Matthew's child made her feel trapped in a way she had never felt before. In a daze, Jessica made her way to Abinah's farm. When Abinah saw her approach, he knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Jessica collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Between sobs, Jessica told Abinah everything, about the 2 weeks when she had inexplicably fallen in love with Matthew, about how she couldn't understand why she had acted that way, and finally, about the pregnancy. Abinah listened in shock and growing anger. He had noticed Jessica's absence over those 2 weeks but had assumed Matthew was keeping her locked up in the house. The truth was far worse than he had imagined. "He must have used juju on you," Abinah said, his voice shaking with rage. "There's no other explanation." "Oh, Jessica, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you better." Jessica shook her head. "It's not your fault," she said. "But Abinah, I can't have this baby. I can't bear to carry the child of that monster." Abinah was torn. On one hand, he shared Jessica's revulsion at the idea of her carrying Matthew's child. On the other hand, the thought of ending a pregnancy went against everything he had been taught. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "This is a big decision," Jessica, maybe we should think about it more. But Jessica was adamant. I've made up my mind, she said firmly. I won't have this baby. Will you help me? Reluctantly, Abina agreed. They decided to visit a local medicine man who was known for providing herbs that could end pregnancies. The medicine man lived in a small hut on the outskirts of the village. When Jessica and Abina arrived, the old man seemed to know immediately why they had come. You seek to end a pregnancy, he said, his rheumy eyes fixed on Jessica's face. Jessica nodded, unable to speak. The medicine man sighed heavily and shuffled to the back of his hut. He returned with a small bundle of herbs. Brew these into a tea and drink it all at once, he instructed Jessica. But be warned, this is powerful medicine. It will cause great pain, and there is always a risk. Jessica took the bundle with shaking hands. She knew the risk, but in her mind, any risk was better than carrying Matthew's child. They thanked the medicine man and left. Instead of returning to Matthew's house, Jessica went with Abina to his small hut. There, she brewed the herbs as instructed and, with Abina watching anxiously, drank the bitter concoction. For a while, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, Jessica was hit with a wave of intense pain. She doubled over, clutching her stomach and crying out. Abina, panicked, didn't know what to do. He held Jessica as she writhed in pain, her screams growing louder and more agonized. We should get help, Abina said, his voice shaking with fear. But Jessica, through gritted teeth, refused. No, can't let anyone know, she gasped. The pain continued to intensify. Jessica felt as if her insides were being torn apart. She was sweating profusely, her body shaking uncontrollably. Abina, feeling helpless, could only watch as the woman he loved suffered. He prayed fervently, begging God to spare Jessica's life. But his prayers went unanswered. After hours of excruciating pain, Jessica's body went limp in Abina's arms. Her eyes, which had been clenched shut in agony, slowly opened, unfocused and glassy. Abina, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry, I love you. And with those words, Jessica took her last breath. Abina, in shock, held her lifeless body, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, was gone.